Hello, I'm Father Chuck Peak, interim rector at St. Mark's on the Campus Episcopal Church, and we're inside the church here today as we record another episode of the Big Red Doors, a teaching series that we're doing. And we're looking right by me and over my left shoulder at one of the stations of the cross, the depictions of Jesus carrying the cross on his way to crucifixion. Those stations actually came about in this way as the empire became interested in its eastern origins. Constantine sent his mother, Helena, to the Holy Land to see if she could discover the way that Jesus had walked on his way to the crucifixion, and as popular mythology of the day, if she could find one of the actual shreds of the original cross, a piece from the cross, what were called relics. She, of course, found the way, or at least what we think may have been reasonably the way, and she believed she had found one of those relics. We may doubt whether anybody actually ever knew which of the crosses on that hill was Jesus's, or whether anybody had ever collected it and separated it into pieces. But in those days it wasn't doubted, and so at least those pieces are relics of Christian devotion, even if they're not actual relics of the case. But out of that came the notion that we could follow the steps Jesus followed on his way to crucifixion by marking the way and by blending legend and scripture and other things into a story of Jesus going from trial to crucifixion to death. And those came from Helena's first visit there. The blending of scripture and legend was always governed by the scriptural passages that we could allude to through it, but some of the episodes depicted were simply legendary actions that took place in some people's minds along the way of the journey. But the important thing about the stations of the cross that I want to talk about today, we've looked at some of those stations before, is simply that they represent for us our own pilgrim way. One of the ways of describing the Christian life is a life of pilgrimage from its beginning to its end. And so in that pilgrimage, what do we encounter? We encounter times of trial and humiliation. We encounter times of even having people bear false witness against us, or sadly, sometimes true witness against us that's rather embarrassing and shameful for us. We encounter the bearing of burdens, the having to carry our own, or having the opportunity to help someone else carry theirs. We encounter times we stumble. We fall, we find ourselves under tremendous stress. We find that we need help. We reach out to other people, one of the hardest things for us to do. We find our path accompanied by men and women who play a role in our lives and become important to us. And we find eventually that the way of the cross is the way of life, the way of sacrificial giving of our lives, offering our lives for others, is in fact the way to the happiness God has in mind for us, to being the people God has in mind for us. And the stations of the cross, interestingly, usually the traditional stations end with the crucifixion and death and burial. They end, that is, as the original of Mark's gospel ended. There's no particular resurrection story in the original ending to Mark's gospel. There's no particular resurrection story to the stations of the cross, although many people have added a 15th station showing the risen Jesus. The stations aren't there to remind us so much of the resurrection. We come to those stations because we already live in the resurrection of Jesus. They come to remind us that the way to resurrection, the way to new life, the way to transformation is often not an easy one, often a narrower road than would be easy to follow, often a road of stumbling and of needing help. And in fact, that those are all right. The way of humility is part of the way of the cross, and the stations of the cross celebrate the humility of Jesus as he goes to his death and urge us to that same humility in the bearing of our burdens and the burdens of one another. So I wanted to visit again these stations of the cross to remind us of them not just as an aid to our devotional life, but as to a pattern of things that tell us how in the world Jesus comes to offer salvation to us through our own lives and through his accompanying us on our own pilgrimage, just like the pilgrimage he himself took from trial to death. Thank you for joining us for another in the series of the Big Red Door.